Though he was within his authority to stop Mr. Aburas and seize the cash he was transporting, he did so with very little evidence to suggest that the money was involved in illegal activity, and a considerable amount of evidence to suggest that it was not. Nothing that Trooper Elmore did during this encounter was outside the bounds of his authority, however. That may be the most disturbing aspect of this interaction. It's difficult to fault members of law enforcement for taking advantage of government-sponsored programs that encourage departments to engage in civil asset forfeiture and offers financial incentives for seizing large amounts of cash. Police departments all across the country have routinely employed the use of federally sponsored programs to seize large sums of cash that would eventually be returned to the department and added to their budget. In fact, according to a 2008 investigative series on National Public Radio, some Texas sheriff's departments rely on forfeited money for up to 1/3 of their budgets. These investigations also found some highly irregular spending from departments who use these programs, such as a $90,000 Dodge Viper for the county's DARE program in Camden County, Georgia, and $20,000 for TV commercials for the district attorney's re-election campaign in Webb County, Texas, to name a few. There are a litany of implications associated with civil asset forfeiture, and the topic has been hotly debated by legal scholars and civil rights activists for years. There are no doubt some positive aspects to the concept of asset forfeiture, especially in a climate where police officers are expected to be highly trained and efficient, but departments are facing the serious prospect of being defunded to some degree.
The state of Texas versus one 2005 Ford Mustang. That's the name of a real lawsuit filed, as the name would suggest, by the state against, again, as the name would suggest, a car. So there's my goofy hook to get you interested. But the real story is, I promise, much meatier. Today we're talking civil asset forfeiture. That's what it's called when law enforcement agencies can take and keep a person's cash and property without actually charging that person with a crime. Jolie McCullough with the Texas Tribune knows a lot about this now. She researched it for a huge report. She was part of the Tribune team that gathered a bunch of data on civil asset forfeiture across Texas. So, Jolie, your team found out a lot, but I'm going to ask you to sum up that data you gathered for us.
Sure. So we spent about a year looking through court records in 4 different counties in Texas. We looked at 560 cases where police are seizing property from people. That's about, in the cases we looked at, it was about $10 million and about 100 vehicles were seized. Some of the big things that we found out of that was half of those seizures were for less than $3,000. A lot of them came from traffic stops, and many were tied to small amounts of drugs. So say someone was pulled over and they had a gram of marijuana and also $1,000, they would sometimes seize that money and then they would fight to keep it.
Okay, so you've alluded to this, but yeah, what are the reasons that law enforcement is allowed to seize and does seize property like this? Why do they do this?
Right, so there is a whole section of the criminal code on this, and basically police have to say they likely suspect that it is tied to criminal activity. So most of these cases are tied to drugs. There's some where it's tied to prostitution, things like that, but basically if they believe that the money you have is tied to selling drugs or you are going to use that money to buy drugs, that's how they could seize it.
Okay. So then where does the property go? What happens to this cash or these cars?
Yeah, so in Texas, the local police agency who seizes the property and the local prosecutor, so the district attorney's office, which is then the office that is fighting in court to keep the money that was seized, they split the proceeds. So usually it can change jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but it's generally about 70% of the proceeds go to the law enforcement agency itself, and then about 30% will go to the prosecutor.
You say proceeds, which I think gives me the answer to this next question. Does the owner ever get the property back?
So sometimes. It's not common. So the thing with this is it's also through civil court, so you don't have a right to an attorney. Sometimes if it's small amount of dollars that are taken, say $1,000 or $2,000, if you wanted to fight that, there's attorney's fees. You would have to pay for your lawyer yourself. If you don't fight it in court, it automatically goes to law enforcement. It automatically is forfeited to the law enforcement agencies. So about 60% of people we found in the cases we looked at didn't fight it at all. They didn't even file an initial answer. And of the cases we looked at, only I think it was about 4% got everything back, so it's pretty rare.
So even if this person who owned this property to begin with is never charged or they're found not guilty, that doesn't automatically get them their property back?
Not at all, because it's a completely separate system. So like you said, it's the state of Texas versus a 2005 Ford Mustang. There might be a criminal charge attached to it as well, like the person who's owned the car might be charged with, say, drug possession or dealing drugs, but that's in the criminal courts, completely separate. In the cases we looked at, 20% didn't have a related criminal charge at all, like not even a charge was filed, and then in 40% of the cases there was no conviction, so they weren't found guilty.
I'm going to ask you to answer these questions a little quickly because I'm running out of time, but what do proponents of the practice, why do they support it, and why do opponents oppose it?
Sure. So law enforcement have claimed this is a vital tool that they need, especially to fight things like the drug cartels. They'll say you can't always hit the drug cartels where it hurts the most is to hit their money supply. And they'll claim most of this is, even if it's street dealers, it's still money that's going back to the cartel. Opponents are very against this because they think it goes against property rights and citizen rights, and they've even claimed in some ways that it's unconstitutional to seize this without needing a criminal conviction or even charge.